Well, I'm Barry Fisher. I was a crime lab director and forensic scientist for the LA County Sheriff's Department for a period of 40 years. Worked there from 1969 to 2009. So saw a lot of stuff.
Amazing. I mean, you started there, a year after RFK was assassinated at the Ambassador Hotel.
Yep.
A year after Ramon Navarro was, infamously murdered in his home, and the year of the Tate LaBianca murders at the hands of the Mansons. I mean, what
Right.
a time you moved to LA.
Yep, it was during the Charlie Manson case. His girls would be sitting right outside the crime lab, which at the time was at 501 North Main, just next to the Olvera Street Church. And they were all lined up there, half a dozen of them with little crosses carved into their foreheads to emulate their fearless leader. It was just an amazing situation. That was my entree into the field of crime.
And you're welcome to Los Angeles.
Yes, and my welcome to Los Angeles.
And what else do you remember from the Manson times, that case? Does there anything else stand out to you?
It was just kind of surreal, what he had done and what he had hoped to do. That helter-skelter thing that Vince Bugliosi, the prosecutor on the case, tried to show and ultimately did. Manson thought that he could start a race riot for whatever reason why he wanted to do this, but it was something else to see this unfold. At the time, it was one of the biggest cases to be prosecuted in Los Angeles and possibly around the country, and just interesting. And of course, Manson had a defense attorney who, I can't remember who he was, but he was pretty disruptive to the overall trial.
Yeah, I think he kept objecting to everything.
Right.
Because what else are you going to do, I guess,
Yeah.
right? Your crime lab didn't have anything to do with the Mansons.
No,
that was LAPD?
Happily, it was a city case. And I say that on purpose because we had been involved in over the years, a number of serial murder cases, and it just sucks the oxygen out of the room with the media looking over your shoulder constantly, and it makes the job all that more difficult.
And why is that? What is tough about the media looking over your shoulder?
Well, because they're constantly asking questions, and you have to stop, you have to start. They want to come through and film what's going on in the laboratory. You have to turn off the phones, the PA system, and we try. I guess the sheriff at the time wanted to be as open and even-handed as he could, so you have to have some degree of freedom of access for the media.
Right.
I had an undergraduate degree in chemistry and a master's degree in organic chemistry. And along the way, I also picked up an MBA.
Right. So for people looking at CSI as the show, just know the educational background is...
Unless you're just looking to do the crime scene stuff, which in most places either use police and also civilian employees, where an AA degree or a bachelor's degree in police science would be satisfactory. If you wanted to work in a crime lab, you need a hard science degree, whether it's biology, biochemistry, chemistry, something along those lines, in order to get your foot in the door, because it's applied science.
Where do you want to start with some of the cases that stand out to you from your career?
Well, the Night Stalker case was a pretty big one. That was handled by a whole bunch of different agencies, but we had a significant piece of that particular case.
Because he had victims all over Southern California, now, even outside LA County.
Even up in San Francisco.
Right.
What happened was we started to get these murder cases. And one of the fellows that was going out to these crime scenes from the lab noticed these unusual footprints outside of the residence in the mud where the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez, broke into homes. And took plaster casts of these, and he recognized after 2 or 3 of these that we were probably dealing with a serial murder case. We went as far as identifying the brand of shoe and the approximate shoe size. So we determined early on that it was a Via shoe impression, size 11.5, 12-ish. And we tried to do something with that. Turned out that we weren't able to. A little footnote.
No pun intended.
No pun intended. A little footnote to the story. The scene switched from Southern California up to Northern California, and there were a couple of murders up in the Bay Area. At the time, the mayor of San Francisco, what was her name? Became state senator.
Feinstein. Is it Dianne Feinstein?
Dianne Feinstein.
Yeah.
She was keen to do a press conference about this case, and she let it out that one important piece of evidence that the police had was these shoe prints. After that piece of news went out, we never saw those shoes again. And that's why the police keep this evidence tight, close to the vest, because they don't want it to get out for the bad guy to learn what they know about what's happening. So anyway, this case went on and on. We kept on seeing it mushroom. Eventually, the press got wind that we were dealing with a serial case, and that's when we all wished that it was still kind of quiet, because the press just makes things more difficult. They want to know what's going on all the time and what you can and can't tell them, and it just makes your job that much more difficult to get it done. Anyway, eventually Ramirez got caught because the state of California recently opened up their digital fingerprint process, this Cal ID system, which kept records of fingerprints of people who had been arrested and convicted, and we could start to compare fingerprints that were collected at crime scenes against that system.
So before that, there wasn't just a big central database of fingerprints.
It was all on fingerprint cards, and you had to.
Who knows where, right? Like if he was arrested up in San Francisco, you'd have to have access to their cards, right?
Right,
yeah.
right. And even though the state, the CII, got in many cases copies of these cards, it was a Herculean task to actually go through and search these cards manually. So anyway, Cal ID makes a match, and the question comes up, and I remember the sheriff and the chief of police at the time and other people who were involved in it had to make a decision whether or not to release this information to the media. There was some concern about whether or not to do this and what impact it would have in the case. Ultimately, they did, and Ramirez's picture was posted on the front page of the LA Times, and he was out in East LA buying a newspaper or something. Some citizens saw him. They ran him down, beat him up a bit until the police came, and that was the start of his downfall.
So he was identified by fingerprints, and then that led to them putting his picture in the paper. And
Right.
so in a forensic science, eventually working hand in hand with the media
Right.
in a controlled way, ended up helping
Right.
solve the case, basically.
The laboratory doesn't have any control about what is going to happen with this evidence once it's uncovered.
Once it's shared with various agencies and other detectives, anybody can call, right?
The higher ups have to make that particular decision. But in this case, the question was, the concern was, if this information got out, he might have split the area. He may have
Right.
gotten
There's
away.
my picture in the newspaper. I'm out of here.
And as it turned out, there was so much interest on the part of the public and coverage in the paper that that was his demise.
Right.
He was a sick puppy.
I mean, I was a kid in Orange County when that was happening, and I do remember he was like a real life monster, like a real life horror. The way he was played up in the press, and he was an awful person, obviously. But he became almost like mythical in how evil he was. You know, the Night Stalker is going to get you, kind of thing. You know.
In Los Angeles, detectives have arrested a 57-year-old ex-police mechanic in connection with the murders of 10 people.
At about 9:20, we made an arrest here in the 1700 block of 81st Street of the suspect that has been known to many as the Grim Sleeper. The suspect is Lonnie David Franklin. He's 57 years of age.
That particular case was a watershed event in expanding the use of DNA. Before that, you needed to have a biological sample from a suspect and be able to compare it to somebody in a database to put it together, because you're at a crime scene, a murder scene, and there's some blood or semen or what have you at the scene. You test it, get a DNA result, put it into this CODIS database, this national DNA database, and if somebody is in that database who had been convicted of a crime, you have a match. Here, there was never a match. And what the cops up in Northern California did, which was a first, was that they went to, I don't know how they got the idea, if the people who were doing genealogy went to the police or vice versa, but anyway, there was a connection. And they decided that it may be possible, by looking at aspects of the DNA collected at the crime scene, to look at portions of that DNA and compare it to a close relative of the individual. So this takes a lot. It's not a straightforward thing. You need to have people who are familiar with dealing with these relationships between generations of family members, these genealogists, and also have somebody there who is also familiar with the DNA. At the time, these were two very distinct areas, and this has since kind of begun to consolidate. And after doing a whole bunch of testing, they finally found an individual that had some features that was a close relationship to the suspect. The police began to do some old-fashioned police work, and they figured out that this particular individual could be the suspect in the case that they're looking for, and they started to follow him. And I guess they followed him to a coffee shop. I don't know if it was a Winchell's or a whatever. And he had a cup of coffee, and he threw the cup away when he finished with it. The police were right behind there. They fished it out, and they did typing on the cup, on the saliva on the cup from the individual, and bingo, it was him. So that was a huge turnabout from the way DNA had been done before. It just opened up all kinds of new possibilities that were just dreams prior to that.
And yeah, now it's common practice to trail someone until they drop a piece of gum on the ground or a cup in a trash can.
Right.
And now it's common practice to go to the genealogy websites where people have uploaded their, to find
Right.
out what their, background
Right.
is and all that, right?
But it continues to be an issue of having Big Brother looking over your shoulder. There are lots of people in our community, and across the country for that matter, that worry about the government having that much information about your genetic profile.
Right.
And there's a reasonable argument there, because if you imagine that DNA at some point is going to be able to tell if you are predisposed to a particular disease, and if insurance companies can get access to that information, they may not want to sell you insurance, or say it's a pre-existing condition and you're just not covered. So you just can't dismiss it out of hand to say that these people are just misguided. They do have a point. And the solution to this is to have enough government controls and oversight that it's not misused.
Right. So the Grim Sleeper turned out to be a guy named Lonnie Franklin Jr., and he was active primarily in kind of South Central LA. I believe he was killing sex workers primarily. He was convicted, and he ultimately died in prison, I think, from an illness.
This jury has decided that Orenthal James Simpson is not guilty on all counts in the murder of his ex-wife, Ann Ron Goldman. He walks out of this court a free man, but a changed man.
The courtroom testimony in these cases is often the key, because you could be the Albert Einstein of forensic science, and if you can't explain what you did to a jury who probably has a high school education, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, and explain it to them in a convincing way that they can understand it, is really key. I remember early on I was testifying on a drunk driving case, and I was dealing with a pretty savvy defense lawyer. And he says to me, he said, "Mr. Fisher, when you examine the alcohol in this blood sample, could you see it? The amount that you actually analyzed was probably in the parts per million, or even smaller than that. If I held it up in front of you, you could not see it." So I said, "That's true." But then I used what I thought at the time was a clever analogy, and I said, anybody who lives here in California, in Southern California, who has to face a smoggy day, is able to detect air pollutants in smaller quantities than I'm detecting alcohol in a blood sample. So watching the jury, and I could see the lights go off, that they understood that the defense attorney was just blowing smoke, that
Right.
his argument didn't really count for very much.
So you can't see individual smog particles, but you can look out at a cityscape and see the smog, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
But even if you can't see it, your eyes start to water, and your nose runs and
Right.
whatnot, and you know it's there.
There's telltale signs, just like there is
Right.
in chemistry, basically, right? What this brings me to the OJ case, and that was a challenge for them, was making what at the time was cutting edge science with DNA palatable to a jury of laymen, basically. What is that?
This is my particular take on it. It's my opinion, and it's been quite a few years since that case was in the news media. The DNA was relatively new at the time, and it was the hottest thing around. And they thought that that was all that they needed to show that this blood of the victims of the crime was present in some of the things in contact with OJ, which was fine.
Because they had victim's blood, I think, at his house and
Right.
his blood at the scene
Right,
because the
right,
attacker
right,
cut himself, and
But
they thought this is a slam dunk.
well, I'm sure they did, but they had a very powerful defense team. They called it these were world-class professionals who had been there and done that.
Right, the dream team.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what they wound up doing is to slowly and methodically attack small portions of the case. And the name of the game was to raise reasonable doubt on the part of the jury. When the judge gives a jury instruction at the conclusion of the case, and he explains what reasonable doubt is, that doesn't mean any doubt. Just means, is there something here that's bothering you that you just can't fit into the evidence? And that's what Johnny Cochran did with the gloves. If the gloves don't fit, you must acquit.
Right.
Argument. And he was masterful at this. And little by little, he was successful in raising doubts on the part of the jury. How did the blood get to the crime scene? Well, could it have been purposefully added there by some nefarious reason? Or was it accidental? Or was there some other unexplained reason that this happened? And did they follow proper protocol in getting the blood to the laboratory? There was one part there where the cop got a sample of blood and he put it in his pocket. And he didn't get it to the laboratory till much later. And apparently there were some SOPs, some standard operating procedures in the laboratory that required them to immediately take the evidence to the laboratory, which they failed to do. Aha, here's a mistake that they made,
Right.
whether it was intentional or unintentional, but it raises a question, does this have some negative impact on the quality of the evidence? So
could it have been tampered with? Chain of
Exactly.
custody is all.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So as a consequence, they were able to slowly and surely, methodically blow holes into the case. And what seemed to be a slam dunk at the start, it turned out wasn't.
I'm fascinated by the Sal Mineo murder case. I've been to that area where he was killed, where his apartments were there, just off Sunset Boulevard on Holloway. People that have been to if you know LA, if you've ever been to Barney's Beanery, that's kind of down the street from where he was. He is right behind Sunset Plaza section of Sunset Strip, and it was a row of apartments. And then behind the apartments, there was carport area, but it was kind of like a back alley. It was off the street. So if you wanted to rob somebody, it was a good place to find someone and have them isolated. And that is what happened. And Sal Mineo was an actor, probably most famous for being in Rebel Without a Cause, starring alongside James Dean in that movie, and ironically gets killed at the end of the movie.
Right. He was in Exodus and a number of other movies.
Yeah. So he was stabbed to death in a botched robbery attempt. Behind his apartment after parking his car one night. So what do you remember from that?
Well, I remember I was sent down to the morgue to collect some evidence off of his remains, and I saw him dead. It's kind of weird.
Right.
Yeah. I don't remember if I found anything of any consequence. That particular case is an example of police who wind up having tunnel vision.
Right.
They decided that because Sal Mineo was gay, that the crime had something to do with his sexual proclivities.
And from their perspective, he had shady characters coming in and out of his apartment, and also his wallet wasn't taken. So
Right.
they thought, oh, it wasn't a robbery then.
So they focused in on that notion for a few years,
This was a personal thing.
it got them nowhere. And then what happened was the district attorney, and this is no mystery, DAs need to clear cases as best they can. They like to play, let's make a deal. If you are charged with something and you can give us some useful information, we'll go easier on you. And that's what happened. A guy came forward and he says to the DA, I know what happened in the Sal Mineo murder case. And if you go easy on me, I'll be happy to share that information. And that ultimately broke the case because he had some legitimate information about who was involved, and
Right.
that was it.
Yeah, and the person who had done it, he didn't even realize who he had killed.
That's right.
Until he heard it on the radio that night when he went
right.
home. Then he freaked out.
It was just a random street crime,
Yeah.
and
He was looking for someone to stick up, and it's just wrong place, wrong time for Sal
exactly,
Mineo.
yep. But that was I've lectured about that all over the place, and I tell
Because of the tunnel vision with the detective.
right because I tell people that when you are investigating a case, if you're from the lab's perspective and you come up with some information and then you want to take that and draw some inference from that, you need to be careful that bias, some sort of bias, even if it's unintended bias, might creep in to your decision making. And take a breath and consider alternatives to how something may have occurred.
Right. Yeah, it could be a cultural bias that you don't even realize you have as an investigator.
Well, one of the challenges is people in my business oftentimes work in law enforcement. So you're dealing with police investigators all the time, and oftentimes it's the same investigators. So you develop a camaraderie, in some cases you may be socializing with them. And so when the police come down and they say, we're pretty sure this is the right guy, and here's some evidence, and we would like you to demonstrate that to us, that presents all kinds of issues, because did that information that the detective gave you seep into your subconscious and cause you to act in some kind of unintended bias fashion? So it's a challenge.
So how can that affect, because you're dealing with science, so how can that still affect someone in a lab?
Well, I'll give you one of the most famous cases dealing with DNA evidence. This is an FBI case, the Madrid train bombing case. There was this terrorist incident in Madrid, and the Spanish police found a plastic bag where the explosives had been kept, and there was a fingerprint, a partial fingerprint on the bag. And through Interpol, they sent it all over the world to see if anybody could identify this particular case. So it comes to the FBI lab in Quantico, Virginia. And the investigators are really, eager. We're the FBI, we're going to solve this case. And they do an evaluation, and they find a print that kind of sort of matches. Turns out to be this guy, Brandon Mayfield, in, I think it was in Oregon. He happened to be an attorney who was a convert to Islam, and he had been defending Muslim people for crimes. And they say, my God, this is it. We got him. So they send the information back. In the meanwhile, the Spanish police identify somebody else, and the FBI was wrong. And it turned out they did a fairly exhaustive study about what happened was, and it was that the investigators who brought the evidence down were kind of hovering over the fingerprint examiner's shoulder. Kind of, I don't know if egging him on is the right term, but cheering him on. Boy, it'd be great if we could solve this case.
Pressuring him a little bit, sure.
And it turned out it wasn't the right guy.
Wow.
And that was a clear case of bias, because it was a fact that the pressure that the investigators were bringing to the examiner caused this mishap. Eventually they had to apologize to the guy, and they came up with some nice financial settlement for their oops.
Wow.
So another one of these late night call-outs. I'm called to East Los Angeles Sheriff Station. This is in the probably late 70s. There was some brown berets going around. The authorities paid a lot of attention to these kinds of cases. So I get out, it must have been about 4 o'clock in the morning, I get out to East Los Angeles Sheriff Station. And the place is a bevy of action. There are police in raid jackets from every available imaginary agency. There's the sheriff, there's the LAPD, the FBI, the ATF, the district attorney. They're all hovering around deciding what to do. They had been told by a member of the community that there was a group of brown berets who were threatening to do some really nasty things held up in this house. And they were getting ready to serve a search warrant and discover what was going on there. So I'm trying to get an idea of what it is that they want from me personally there. And they say, well, we expect to find some explosives, and we need somebody to test this stuff. And I'm thinking to myself, I hadn't gotten my ticket punched on how to test for explosives yet. So I call up my boss, who did have the experience.
And you don't want to get your ticket punched to the next life.
Right. So I called my boss, and he comes out there. And there's this bevy of discussions going on, how we're going to do this. We actually go out to a few blocks from the crime scenes. It's still dark. And they're looking with binoculars to see what's going on. It was something out of a TV movie, I swear to you. It was like surreal. So we get back to the to the sheriff's station, and they decide, okay, first light, they're going to leave. They have fire trucks deployed in case there's an explosion. They have snipers up on rooftops in case something bad happens. They launch a helicopter to fly overhead. And there's 4 police cars filled with cops, district attorneys, and me and my boss. The plan is to leave us off about a block away. And we drive out of the sheriff's station, and 2 cars are going up the street northbound, and the other 2 cars are coming southbound, and they forget about us. Cars pull up to a screeching halt in front of this residence, and cops fall out with shotguns and pistols and everything, laying prone on the grass in front of the house, behind the cars, and these two district attorneys go up to the front door and knock on the door to say that they have a search warrant. And me and my partner are sitting in the back seat in a state of, we're catatonic. What are we supposed to do? So I said I elbow him, I say, we better get out and get across the street. So we walk across the street to one of these really large palm trees, and we're hiding behind the trees and peeking out every once in a while. I had this vision of this cartoon character, a Disney character, looking to see what's going on. They secure the crime scene, and all these cops start doing their thing. And to my horror, there was no control. Nobody knew what the hell they were doing. They had knives and whatnot. They were tackle boxes and whatnot, and they were popping them open. If they were booby-trapped, we'd all be dead. Clueless. It was a total cluster. Nobody could figure out what was going on. At the end of this crime scene search, they found a baggie of marijuana and 2 rounds of ammunition.
Of course.
That was it. Find out after all of this that the neighbors across the street got pissed off at these kids because they had shot at the house and hit their residence. And to get back at them, they made up this concocted story about the Brown Berets planning an event
Right.
at the place.
It was just idiots being idiots.
Right. So what happens to me, I'm driving home after I'm thinking to myself, I could have gotten killed.
Right.
I didn't sign up for this.
Right.
Now, who knows?
I'm supposed to be in a lab.
Yeah.
I just had a question for you. Have you watched or you followed at all the this David? Do you follow cases today that are of any interest or anything like that? The one I was just curious. The one that I've been following since the beginning. This guy named David. He's a recording artist. He has a weird spelling. He uses the number 4.
Actually, I was interviewed for local TV
as like an expert on that
as
one.
an expert on that one.
It's
too.
a fascinating case, even before I knew who was involved.
Right.
Just when they found the body at the tow yard.
She was in the frunk of a Tesla.
That's right. Yeah, chopped up and in
Yeah.
I think bags, and
Yeah.
they noticed the smell after a while. We were having
Right.
a heat wave at that time. I
Right.
remember.
The reporter wanted to know if I could, what kind of evidence would we find? Does this cause problems in conducting a forensic investigation? Duh.
Yeah, chopped up, rotting.
Of course it does. It doesn't mean that there's nothing there, but it would slow you down for sure.
Yeah, I think they are having trouble even determining manner of death at this point.
Well, I told the reporter, I said, here's the problem. There has to be some sort of tangible connection between him and the deceased involving the murder. The fact that they knew one another,
Right.
the fact that she's found in his car, does not mean that he did it. So there needs to be a connection between the events and stuff. So
Right. Yeah,
So
and I
that-
think they finally determined that she was stabbed, I think, twice.
yeah.
And that was
Well, but
but,
are they going to be able to prove that he did it?
right.
I mean, there's circumstantial evidence, but that may or may not get them to where they want to be.
And with the body in the state, it's saying, how do you know that she wasn't stabbed afterwards? I guess there's a lot. If you're someone with means, which he is to some extent, anyways, he wasn't super famous, but he was doing well. A lawyer could probably, some of the things we've talked about here in this interview,
Right,
cause some doubt.
right. So who knows?
Yeah. Wow.
I started working at the sheriff's lab on Cinco de Mayo, May 5th, 1969.
Wow.
And they had me assigned to doing toxicology, looking for drugs in blood and urine samples. And at the time, there were all of 12 criminalists at the laboratory, and criminalists were expected to go out on crime scenes. And
What is a criminalist for people who don't know?
those are the forensic scientists, the people, the scientists that work in crime labs.
And for comparison, how many are there now?
200 to 300.
Wow. So back then there were only 12.
Right.
Got it.
Yeah. The notion was that at some point they would begin to take newbies out to crime scenes to get them trained. You know, this is not a subject that you learn how to do in college. If you're in a chemistry curriculum, they don't tell you how to collect evidence in a murder case. So I knew this was going to happen, and I was purposefully keeping a low key because I didn't feel like doing this. I had never seen a dead body up to that point, and I was a little skittish, to be honest with you, about my first encounter. Anyway, one day my number is up, and they tell me, we're going out to a crime scene, you're coming with us, and no amount of complaints that I could raise was working. So there were two experienced people and myself. We hopped into a car and drove out to a little bedroom community in Redondo Beach, California. As we're getting closer, I said, what kind of case is this? And almost nonchalantly, one of them says to me, oh, it's an axe murder case. So I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, an axe murder case.
It's going to be a horror scene.
Yes. So we pull up, and the sheriff at the time wanted everybody to look spiffy, so we were in suits and ties and jackets. Nothing like you see in television right now, where you're wearing these hazmat suits and whatnot. We get out of the car, and we each had our toolkit in attaché cases. So we looked like business people, accountants or something,
Right.
walking up to this house to make a house call. And the first thing that struck me was that there was this homicide detective lieutenant standing outside. He was old school because he was wearing a fedora, and not too many people were still wearing fedoras by this is the early 70s, 70, 71. And he kind of looks us up and down, and I'll never forget, I remember the Jackie Gleason show, the way Jackie Gleason would kind of snarl at people, and he would say, and what do we have here? He says to us, oh, we're from the crime lab, three young-looking guys who definitely did not look like we belonged. So we go into the home, and what happened was I recall that in my mind time just slowed down. Everything was like in slow motion. We walked through this dim hallway into a living room area, and I noticed that there was a scuffle. A lamp had been knocked over, and the incandescent bulb was still lighted, so it had this eerie kind of soft white glow projecting around the room. And on the floor is this victim, and I'm looking at this, and my first reaction was, this is a mannequin. It can't be a former living person. It just, I couldn't wrap my brain around it. And she was a young woman in her 30s, had an axe sticking out of her forehead, with blood and brain material against the wall, from the splatter. And her eyes were open, and her hand was like in her mouth, and she just had this, to me, it looked like a look of horror about her, and I just, fixated on that. And that, I can conjure up that image now over 50 years later. It's something that sticks with you, and I'm sure that if you talk to any cop with a horrendous case, they'd have the same kind of experience. What happened was that this woman surprised a residential burglar who had broken into her house with a roofing axe, and there was a scuffle, and he killed her. In the afternoon, her teenage daughter, who was in junior high at the time, came home and found her mother. Must have been a
Terrible.
horrific sight for the kid, for this little girl. To this day, I have no idea whatever happened to that case. I don't know if it was solved or unsolved. It was just my very first murder case, and it just kind of sticks with me.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, for that to be the first dead body you see at a crime scene, to be one that shocking.
Right.
One that would stick with any investigator, even if they were seasoned.
Right. So over the years, I've had some interesting cases. I had this one case. This fellow was incarcerated. In his previous life, before he was locked up, he was a butcher, meat cutter. And that was his nickname in prison, the Butcher. He gets wind that his girlfriend is fooling around with this other guy that he knows. And he promises himself he's going to take care of this. And he gets out, and he winds up murdering this guy.
Murders the guy.
The guy who was fooling with his girlfriend.
Yeah.
The girlfriend, as I recall, goes to the decedent's home and finds the butcher, who sticks a gun in her face and tells her to get the hell out of there. She gets upset, and I guess does what any normal person would do if somebody stuck a gun in their face, calls the cops. The cops show up, and they find they're in the middle of trying to dispose of the body. The butcher, true to form, has dismembered the body. They had tried to put some of the remains down the kitchen garbage disposal, but that kind of jammed up the works. And then they moved on to some more serious efforts. They put the remains of the body in a bathtub, went out and bought a 55-gallon drum of sulfuric acid, and tried to dissolve the body in the acid. And as I tell people, anybody who's had the slightest amount of chemistry knows that they should have used some basic alkaline lye or something like that. Acid, all they succeeded in doing was making a lot of tallow, a big ring around the bathtub, should I say.
Wow. And you say they are doing this, the guy and the girlfriend?
No, the guy and his co-conspirator.
Oh, okay.
The girlfriend is not in the picture at all.
Okay.
So anyway, they arrest him and everything, and we're now months down the road, and we're getting ready to go to trial. And we're doing a pre-trial discussion with the detectives and the district attorney, and the DA, who I happen to know pretty well. We're sitting around blue sky, and he says to me, "You know what would really be helpful in this case? If you went to the morgue and picked up an unclaimed body and tried to reproduce what happens when you try to dissolve a body in sulfuric acid. And I looked at him and I said, "Are you effing out of your mind? You'll have the jury throwing up in the jury box or looking at you like you've lost it." He says, "Well, what can we do?" So I said, "Well, why don't we try this with some pork? You know, it's proteins, it's..."
Pig DNA, very similar to human DNA.
Oh, whatever.
Yeah.
And I thought nothing more of it. A couple of days later, I'm minding my business in the lab, and a couple of homicide detectives come waltzing into the lab. One of them has a piece of butcher paper over his shoulder. They had just come from Vernon, meat packing capital of Southern California, with a big chunk of pig leg over his shoulder, like 50 pounds of pig, and they go thump onto the laboratory bench, and I kind of look at them puzzling, and what's going on? He says, "The DA said you wanted this."
He took you seriously.
Yeah, he took me seriously. So I said, "Oh, God."
So what was the result of that?
So the result is I'm thinking to myself, this is really weird. I've taken all kinds of chemistry classes in college and graduate school. I've never had to do this before. So let's go back to first principles. So I go to the laboratory's toolbox, I take out a hacksaw, and I start cutting steaks. And I put some of this meat into a large beaker, glub, 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 goes the sulfuric acid. Let it sit around for a couple of days, and as I had predicted, even before I did this, nothing much happened. I have no recollection of testifying about this particular aspect of the crime when I went to court to testify. However, the two guys were convicted of first-degree murder. So that was
Wow.
one of my weirder cases. And as long as we're on weird cases, here's another one for you. I get a call out in the middle of the night. Must have been 3, 4 in the morning. And by this time, I had gotten used to getting these early morning phone calls because initially, when it first started, I believed it to be a family member who had passed. But by this time, I knew it was another call out, so I answered the phone.
It's not someone you know yet.
No. So they tell me that they found a body up in Angeles Crest Highway above Pasadena and Temple, that area, in the wooded area. What happened was a teenage girl runaway was hiking down this mountain road and saw a body at the bottom of a ravine. So she goes to contact the rangers at this park. Rangers called the police, the sheriff's department, and the sheriff, ultimately the detective on the case, calls me out to the crime scene to have a look at the body. So I examined the body and didn't find anything of note. Later on, it turns out that there were 4 defendants in this case, plus the 5th guy who was a former partner in this group. The 4 principals who were responsible for the murder would go around to homes in the San Gabriel Valley and eastern part of LA and burglarize home for jewelry. And the 5th guy would take it to pawn shops to sell the stuff to try to make some money. The 4 defendants decided that the salesman was not distributing up the goods in a fair way.
That's the first thing I thought of, was he's going to lie to them about how much he got.
Right. You know, there's no No honesty among thieves.
Right.
So they decide that they're going to exact their revenge, and they take him in a trailer, in a camper, up to the hills, Angeles Crest Highway. And before they kill him, they tell him to get on his knees and say his prayers, and they shot him in the back of the head. Through the body, tumbles down the ravine where he's ultimately found. So the case is getting ready for trial, and one of the defendants decides, let's make a deal. I'm going to give the district attorney some of what I think might be useful information, tell him what happened right before the killing, and maybe he can use this information. So he tells him the following story, that they got him on his knees, say his prayers, and the guy says right before they killed him, he shat his pants. He pooped himself. Anyway, I'm on the witness stand testifying on the case, and the district attorney, just out of the blue, asked me, he says, now, Mr. Fisher, when you were at the crime scene examining the body, did you happen to notice the odor of feces? And I'm about to answer the question, and the 4 lawyers on the case jump up in unison and cry out to the judge, Your Honor, there's no showing that this person has any expertise in this area. We want to take him on voir dire, meaning to question the witness, me, on whether I have the expertise to testify about the odor of feces, of poop. So they start examining me, cross-examining me about my background and this, that, and the other thing. And I'm watching this transpire, and each lawyer is going at it themselves, and there happens to be a blackboard that's facing parallel to the jury box. And the lawyers would get up from time to time, stand up behind the chalkboard where the jury couldn't see them, and they would be laughing at me in hysterics. And I'm watching this, and I'm getting annoyed because I'm running out of euphemisms for poop. And the strange thing happens to me as I'm testifying. I have a flashback to college when I'm taking a class in public speaking, and the instructor says, when you are giving a talk, do not use the same word over and over again because it bores the audience. So this thing is searing into my memory, and I'm saying, okay, how do I describe the subject matter? I can't say some colloquial terms which some people might find offensive. I could say excrement, feces, fecal material. Poop is probably getting a little too close to the edge. So I'm doing this, and I finally had enough, and I look up to the judge and I say, Your Honor, it's my experience that anybody who's changed a diaper knows what it smells like.
Right.
So the judge thought for a moment, slams his gavel down, and he says, Mr. Fish is an expert in this area and may testify. So he says, answer the question. So by this point, I'm feeling a little cheeky, and I say, could you repeat the question?
Nice.
So they tell the court reporter to ask the question. She's pulling back this tape all the way back to where the question was asked, and asked, did you smell the odor of feces? And I answered in one word, no.
Amazing. So, all that for nothing.
All that for nothing. But that was one of my weirder cases.